Hi, boys and girls. I hope you're doing well. I'm going to try to read this out loud and walk you through today's assignment. When you click onto our Google Classroom, you should see under Monday, April 27th at home lesson, this Google form come up. It's called The Perplexity of Zadig, a story from the Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. On the banks of the Euphrates River, there once lived a man called Zadig, who spent all his days watching the animals he saw about him and in learning their ways and in studying the plants that grew near his hut. And the more he knew of them, the more he was struck with the differences he discovered, even in the beasts or flowers which he thought when he first saw them were exactly alike. One morning, as he was walking through a little wood, there came running towards him an officer of the queen's household, followed by several of her attendants. Zadig noticed that one and all in the greatest anxiety and glanced from side to side with wild eyes as if they had lost something they held to be very precious and hoped against hope that it might be lurking in some quiet, impossible place. Here are some things we know about the main character so far. His name is Zadig. He lives on the banks of the Euphrates River. He studies plants and animals around him. You might want to write this down either in your rally books on the margins or on a scrap piece of paper, just so that we can remember the story while we're reading it. The second paragraph right over here says that Zadig noticed an officer of the queen's household and a whole bunch of her attendants seemed to look anxious, as if they had lost something that was precious to them. So I'm going to jot that down on my note paper. So these are my two annotations for the first two paragraphs so far, okay? So you should write these down. If you haven't written these down yet, do that now. Pause this video and then come back to it. On catching sight of Zadig, the first of the band stopped suddenly. And when they say the band, they don't mean a musical band, they mean the group of people. Young man, he said, panting for breath, have you seen the queen's pet dog? Okay, so now we know that Zadig isn't an old man, he's a young man. It's a tiny spaniel, is it not? Answered Zadig, which limps on the left forepaw and has very long ears. Ah, then you have seen it, exclaimed the steward joyfully, thinking that his search was at an end and his head was safe. For he knew of many men who had lost theirs for less reasons. So this attendant thinks he's going to have his head chopped off if he doesn't find the queen's dog. No, replied Zadig, I have never seen it. Indeed, I did not so much as know that the queen had a dog. At these words, the faces of the whole band fell. With sighs of disappointment, they hurried on twice as fast as before to make up for lost time. My next annotation is going to be about the conversation that the queen's people just had with Zadig. So this is for paragraphs, let's see, 4 through 8. So here's another annotation that I made. We have 3 so far. Strange to say, it had happened that the finest horse in the king's stable had broken away from its groom and galloped off. No one knew where the boundless plains. No one knew where over the boundless plains of Babylon. The chief huntsman and the other officials pursued it with the same eagerness that the officers of the household had displayed in running after the queen's dog, and, like them, met with Zadig, who was lying on the ground watching the movements of some ants. "Has the king's favorite horse passed by here?" inquired the great huntsman, drawing rein. "You mean a wonderful galloper 15 hands high, shod with very small shoes, with a tail 3.5 feet long. The ornaments of his bit are of gold, and he is shod with silver?" Yes, that is the runaway," cried the chief huntsman. "Which way did he go?" "The horse? But I have not seen him," answered Zadig, "and I never heard of him before." Now Zadig had described both the horse and the dog so exactly that both the steward and the chief huntsman did not doubt for a moment that they had been stolen by him. My next annotation. Zadig also describes the missing horse let's see, we'll say people are now suspecting Zadig has stolen them. And this is for paragraphs, let's see, 10 through 14. The chief huntsman said no more, but ordered his men to seize the thief and to bring him before the Supreme Court, where he was condemned to be flogged and to pass the rest of his life in exile. Scarcely, however, had the sentence been passed than the horse and the dog were discovered and brought back to their master and mistress, who welcomed them with delight. But as no one would have respected the judges any longer if they had once admitted that they had been altogether mistaken, they informed Zadig that, although he was to be spared by the flogging and would not be banished from the country, he must pay 400 ounces of gold for having declared he had not seen what he plainly had seen. So for this next note, I'm going to write down something about Zadig. Let's see. Was not convicted, but fined. Animals were found. Judges didn't want to admit they were wrong. So now we're on paragraph 16. With some difficulty, Zadig raised the money, and when he paid it into court, he asked permission to say a few words of explanation. This is what he's saying. Moons of justice and mirrors of truth, he began, I swear to you by the powers of earth and the air that never have I beheld the dog of the queen, nor the horse of the king. And if this assembly will deign to listen to me for a moment, I will inform them exactly what happened. Before I met with the officers of the queen's household, I had noticed on the sand the marks of an animal's paws, which I instantly recognized to be those of a small dog. And as the marks were invariably fainter on one side than on the other, the three others, it was easy to guess that the dog limped on one paw. Besides this, the sand on each side of the front paw marks was ruffled on the surface, showing that the ears were very long and touched the ground. So the reason why Zadig knew that that the dog was a small dog with long ears is because he was very observant. He wrote, Zadig explains how he was able to describe the missing dog. He observed marks in the sand. And that was for paragraph 17. As to the horse, I had perceived along the road the traces of shoes, always at equal distances, which proved to me that the animal was a perfect galloper. I then detected on closer examination that though the road was only 7 feet wide, the dust on the trees, both on the right and on the left, had been swept to a height of 3.5 feet. And from that I concluded the horse's tail, which had switched off the dust, must be 3.5 feet long. Next, 5 feet from the ground, I noticed that twig and leaves had been torn off the trees, so evidently there was 15 hands high. As to the ornaments on his bit, he had scraped one of them against a rock on turning a corner too sharply, and some traces of gold remained on it, while the light marks left on the soil showed that his shoes were not of iron, but of a less heavy metal, which could only be silver. So now he just described also how he was able to identify the horse. He's a very observant guy. Great was the amazement of the judges and of everybody else at the perception and reasoning of Zadig. At court, no one talked of anything else, and though many of the wise men declared that Zadig should be burnt as a wizard, the king commanded that the 400 ounces of gold, which he had paid as a fine, should be restored to him. In obedience to his order, the clerk of the court and the ushers came in state to Zadig's hut, bringing with them the 400 ounces. But when they arrived, they told Zadig that 398 of them were due for law expenses. So he was not much better off than before. What's happening right now is that the king tells the court to return the gold to Zadig. But the clerk tells Zadig that 398 pieces of gold, keep in mind this is out of 400, were needed for law expenses. So basically he only has 2 pieces of gold left over. Zadig said nothing, but let them keep the money. He had learned how dangerous it is to be wiser than your neighbors, and resolved never again to give any information to anybody, or to say what he had seen. So based on this paragraph and 19 and 20, we can kind of conclude that, or make an inference, that Zadig is probably not wealthy, because it took him a while to come up with the money, but he was able to. And he's also very humble or down to earth. He doesn't flip out and yell and scream and start a fight. He just decides to stay quiet, keeps his thoughts to himself, and thinks to himself, I'm not going to do that again. He had very speedily a chance of putting this determination into practice. A prisoner of state escaped from the great jail of Babylon, and in his flight happened to pass beneath the window of Zadig's hut. Not long after, the warders of the jail discovered which way he had gone. Excuse me. And cross-questioned Zadig closely. Zadig, warned by experience, kept silent, but notwithstanding, it was proved, or at least they said so, that Zadig had been looking out the window when the man went by. And for this crime, he was sentenced by the judges to pay 500 ounces of gold. So it seems like Zadig really can't win. He decides to keep his mouth shut, and now he still has to pay money. Good gracious, he murmured to himself as, according to the custom of Babylon, he thanked the court for its indulgence. What is one to do? It is dangerous to stand at your own window or to be in a wood which the king's horse and queen's dog have passed through. How hard it is to live happily in this life. So what he's basically saying is that he really feels like he can't do anything right. No matter what he does, he's in the wrong. He was accused when helping and also when just staying quiet. And this was for paragraph 22. Before you go on to the multiple choice questions, look over all of the annotations. You're going to go through and do your multiple choice questions by yourself after looking over the annotations. But I want to point out that the last question asks you to answer in a long sentence. The first paragraph introduces the main character. Identify the main quality of Zadig described in this paragraph. Explain how it is important to the plot. So make sure you go back to the very first paragraph. Here it is. Look it over and notice what they're talking about in this paragraph. How he's studying the plants and animals that grew near them. How he's watching the animals. So you need to pick a word to describe that quality of him. And then write in a full sentence how that is important to the story. We have talked about in class before how authors don't write things just because they have nothing better to do. It's always has an importance to the story. So how is this important to the rest of the story? And make sure that when you're answering, you are using a complete sentence. Just because we are typing in Google Classroom doesn't mean that we don't use punctuation, we don't use capitals at the beginning of our sentences, and that we make sure the Z for Zadig is also capitalized, okay? I hope you guys do well with this, and let me know if you have any other questions. I miss you all so much. Bye, guys. Message me if you have any questions. Say hi, Ann.
Hi.